Hey everyone, welcome back to Dev Parkour. I'm Brian Parks, and in this video, I want to show how I'm going to extend the continuous integration pipeline from last week to actually deploy to a live server. Last week, we stopped just short of deployment because I didn't have a server set up. So in this video, I'm going to show what I did to set up that server and how I modified, and actually I did very little modification to the CICD script, but I'm going to show kind of what it did and walk through what that meant I had to do to set up the server, to configure it, to get it up and running, and show that it is in fact up and running. So let's switch over to Visual Studio Code, and here you can see my .gitlab-ci.yml file. Last week we took care of this test stage and this build stage, but this week basically we're looking at this deploy, and I'm using the deploy prod stage or configuration. So this script is completely unchanged from what it was before. This is exactly what it was when I picked up this app a few weeks ago. This is exactly the state it was in when I last worked on this, several years ago. So basically what we do is we install Git and OpenSSH in our build environment. We pull in a private key, which I'll show you how that works in a minute. Then set up some configuration for SSH, and then run this deploy script, which this deploy script is actually an earlier version of what ultimately turned into a project of mine that I've called Whiskey. I actually did a video on that. That's how I learned Go. I'll leave a link to that in the description below if I remember. This is not using the Go version. This is actually not even using the latest up-to-date Bash version. This is a predecessor to that. So I know there are some issues with this, and I'll point some of them out as I show the result of running the pipeline a little bit later. But what this deploy script basically does is it installs to /var/www/current. That's mentioned a little bit later here. Current. And I can specify an SCP host and an SCP user. So this is the actual machine that things will get deployed to. And then basically what the script does is, let's start with the local side. Basically all it does is it uploads the artifact, basically the result of zipping up all of the files in this project, and this script. So it's this script, the artifact, those get uploaded, and then it runs this script bash this script, and there is a way to specify that it runs the remote version, which is this. So it runs the remote commands on the remote side. And basically what that does is it removes the, I'm getting ahead of myself. It unzips the current version, the new version that's here. It runs composer install. So it actually installs all of the composer packages, which meant that I did need to install composer on the server. And then it basically removes the symlink to the previous current and creates the symlink current to point to the new version. So basically it does kind of an in-place swap. So it, instead of pointing to the previous version, it now points to this version. And then it just kind of cleans up after itself. So it removes the bzip archive that it uploaded. So that's basically what this deployment script does. All it does is it uploads a new batch of files and then updates a symlink. Super simple, nothing crazy. But that does mean that on this VM, we need a web server, we need PHP, we need, in this case, I actually installed MySQL on the server as well, because I wanted to put everything on the same machine, and I actually kind of wanted to see how small I could scale everything. One of the goals of scalability is to really push performance to its limits. And by running everything on one machine, that means that MySQL will take up a bunch of memory, and I'll really get to push the PHP app to the limits of what memory usage it needs, what CPU usage it needs, that sort of thing. So I need PHP, I need a web server. In my case, I'm doing nginx. I need MySQL, and obviously I need Composer. So I needed to install those 4 things, and then I needed to do a little bit of configuration, which I might show a little bit later. But first, we ran off to DigitalOcean, and I created the smallest droplet I could. Droplet is their VPS, kind of similar to EC2 or that sort of thing. I created a 1 gigabyte of RAM, 1 virtual CPU droplet, $5 a month, super cheap. Again, the smallest thing so that I could constrain the resources so that I could run everything on that machine. But even though it's the smallest droplet, the cheapest droplet you could possibly get with DigitalOcean, while I was configuring it, I noticed that the machine was pretty peppy. So I named it demo.glassminnow.com, which is the host name I'm going to use for this droplet. And I grabbed the IP address. So once it spun up, it gave me this IP address. This is a public IP address. Went over to GoDaddy and set up a new A record. Name is demo, which when everything's expanded, that turns into demo.glassminnow.com. Dropped in the IP address and gave it a time to live of 1 week. Let me zoom in there so you can see. So that's what that looks like. And then I needed to do some configuration. So I came over here to MobaXterm and logged in with my username and password. And again, I installed nginx. I installed PHP. I also installed a few extensions. So I think some of what I'm using needed the PHP curl extension, obviously the PHP MySQL extension, the PHP XML extension, and maybe a couple others. And then I installed, not MySQL, I actually installed MariaDB. So that was a Maria server that I installed. So now, if I type MySQL and then show databases, you'll see I've got Glassminnow in there as one of them. So that's PHP, MySQL, a few extensions. I needed to install Composer. The way to do that is I went to Git Composer. It looks like I closed that tab, but gitcomposer.org and go to the download tab. And you just copy this code. And because I'd already installed PHP, just pasted this in. It ran. I also wanted Composer to be in my path, so I did this. Sudo mv composer.var, and then to user local bin composer. And if we switch back to MobaXterm and I do which composer, you can see that it shows up in user local bin composer. So that's all set up. Now, the one thing that doesn't automatically get set up is nginx. So I actually did need to do some configuration there. So that's in etc nginx sites enabled default. I'm only running one app on this server, so it's totally okay to edit the default site. And let's just zoom into the parts that I changed. So by default, it includes this fastcgiphp.com. Now, for what I'm doing, that's actually, it's close, but it doesn't do exactly what I needed it to. So I actually copied these lines from another machine that was running a Pales app. This stuff all came out of the box. I just commented out this line because that's not what I'm using. I'm using the Unix socket right here. And then this stuff is basically the rest of what's included in fastcgiphp.com. And this is super important to make everything work. That I just need, directly unchanged. The important part is, I think this piece right here, which to be honest, I don't remember exactly what it does. I just remember that back in the day, I was having some issues with this, and that's what made it work. So if you know what that actually does, go ahead and leave a comment down below. I'm sure I'll see it and be like, oh yeah, that's what that does. But I don't know. This makes things work. So that's our configuration for nginx. I also did make a change to the phpfpm config because the connection string we're using to get to the database and a couple other settings are set via environment variables. And in order to get them into the PHP process, those actually need to be set when the PHP process starts up. phpfpm starts with the system. So the way I change those is etc php 7.4. For some reason, this is the latest version of Ubuntu, but Ubuntu doesn't come with PHP 8 yet. So PHP 7.4 is what it is. So etc php 7.4 fpm pool.d www.conf. So that's the file we need to edit. And there's a section all the way at the bottom, or pretty close to the bottom, with environment variables. And the file is very well documented. I'm not going to show them because it actually has passwords in it. But that's where we specify the connection string and the root domain for the app. And it's env square bracket name of environment variable, then equals, and then its value. So again, you'll see this when you dive into the configuration file. You'll see exactly what I'm talking about. And a note on VI. I've used VI for years and years and years and years. I really like VI. If you prefer Emacs, go ahead and use Emacs. If you prefer something a little bit easier to get into right off the bat, try Nano. Nano seems to be the go-to text editor, especially for people who have never used Linux before. So if you're a complete new user to Linux, go ahead and try Nano. So that's the configuration that we did. That's all the configuration that was necessary to get this set up so that I could actually start deploying. Actually, that's not entirely true. I am going to cat this one file, .ssh/authorized keys. And this basically says this key is allowed to log in as root to this machine. We'll see where that comes into play a little bit later. And in order to create this key, what I did was I went over to Windows Subsystem for Linux, and I ran ssh-keygen. I just needed a Linux machine. It was convenient that I could do this on my local Windows machine because I'm running WSL. I did SSL keygen, specified a different file name. By default, it tries to save things to .ssh/id_rsa, I believe. So I changed it to .ssh/glassminnow_demo_deploy. And you can see here I've catted the public key. And this is exactly what I pasted into that authorized keys file. Next, I added the private key, which I'm not going to do on camera because it's a private key. And I copied that into a very specific place in GitLab. So if we go over to GitLab, go to Settings, CICD, Variables, I'll expand that. You can see SCP host. See if I edit this. You can see the SCP host is demo.glassminnow.com, SCP user, and then SCP private key. I'm not going to show those on camera again, but you can just click add variable, type in the name of the variable, the value, and then you've got some other options here. So that makes them available to the CICD pipeline, which if we go back here, that means SCP host will get replaced by the SCP host, SCP user gets replaced by the SCP user, and then SCP private key is just the string of the private key. But in order to turn that into something that looks like a file, which is actually what SSH add needs, there's this magical bashism. So less than parens basically says take the string that's in between the parens, or run the command that's in between the parens and make its output look like a file. So we'll see in the output when we actually run this that it talks about adding dev fd some number. Well, that's not a real file. That's a file descriptor, and the reason that it looks like that is because it's kind of manufactured by bash through this magic incantation here. So with that, let's go ahead and look at the pipeline, the last pipeline that ran. So here's the latest pipeline. We've got tests that passed, build that passed. Let's go over to deploy, and we can see deploy to prod ran. Let's look at the log. So starting at the top, we get, okay, we checked out, skipping some modules. There are no submodules here. Downloading the artifacts. Here's our everything getting set up. Get OpenSSH. Okay, great. Start an SSH agent. Add the key, and here's that command that we just looked at. And you can see identity added, dev fd63. Well, that's not a real file, but that's the manufactured file that contains that private key. This is setting up some configuration so that if the host actually changed, it's not an issue. And then we run ci deploy.sh, and you can see here's the output from that. So upload succeeded, running remote commands. This means running on the actual, not the build agent, but running on my DigitalOcean droplet. Running remote commands, deploying app from vz2 to var www, and this is actually the commit hash. So you'll notice that's the same here and here. This is actually a redeploy, so it can't create because it already existed. Yes, do not run composer as root. Yes, I should probably change that, but baby steps. Running composer, downloading, finally downloading. Okay, and now it's basically done. So obviously the script also swaps the symlink over because it's a redeploy. It actually removed the symlink and then put it back, pointing to the same directory it was pointing at before, but this deployment script doesn't know that. But what that means now is that I can go over here, and obviously I've kind of spoiled the ending, but if I refresh, it's working. And I don't think I've actually created a user here, so I don't think I can log in, but it's up and running. You can actually hit this URL, demo.glassminnow.com. You can register if you want. Go right ahead, check it out. this isn't connected to any email or anything like that. It's totally isolated. So I don't think you can break anything. And if you do, well, that'll be good to know. But yeah, you're more than welcome to go here, check it out, and try it out for yourself. As we get further into things, this experience will become more valuable. You'll be able to do more with it and get more of a feel for the real intended experience. So go ahead and check this out. Leave comments down below for things that I should change, for anything else that maybe is worth exploring and making it better as a demo environment. Anything you notice that maybe inhibits it from really being a true scalable app, go ahead and leave those down in the comments below as well. So with that, I'm going to sign off. If you enjoyed this video, go ahead and hit that thumbs up button. If you want to see more videos like that, go ahead and click subscribe and click that notification bell. That'll tell you when the next videos in this series get released, and as I start talking about some of the other things that I'm going to be doing. As always, leave a comment below if you have thoughts, questions, ideas, anything of that nature. I'm really excited to see your input on this and see people start signing up for things like this and play around with it. So let me know what you think, and I will see you in the next one.